Rain has a smell right before it falls, a kind of metal sweetness that clings to the back of the throat, and that was the smell in the air, the night I promised myself I would never let John back into my life. Not the rain itself, just the almost of it, the waiting. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, 17 floors above a city that didn't know my name yet, and I told the sky I was done. Done aching for someone who left. Done checking my phone at 3 in the morning out of habit rather than hope. Done being an omega who flinched every time a certain laugh echoed from a stranger on the street, because for 2 years that laugh had belonged to only one man. My name is James. I was 26 years old, freshly transferred to a company I'd fought hard to get into, and I had exactly one rule left standing after everything: never again. Never again would I let an alpha make promises with his mouth and break them with his silence. I thought that rule was airtight. I thought I had built a wall so high that not even my own biology could climb it. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. That night, all I knew was the rain that hadn't started and the ache in my chest that had nothing to do with weather. My best friend Angel called it my brooding hour. He said I did my best suffering between 11 and midnight, like clockwork, like it was scheduled grief. He wasn't wrong. Angel knew me better than anyone alive, had known me since we were teenagers sharing lunch tables and secrets, and he was the only person who knew the full shape of what John Kestrel had done to me. Angel was a beta, steady and sharp-tongued, immune to the pull that alphas and omegas felt toward one another, and maybe that was why he'd become my anchor. He didn't get swept into the tides the way I did. He just stood on shore and pulled me back when I drifted too far. "You're doing the thing again," he said when I finally picked up his call, my voice still thick with unshed feeling. "The staring at nothing thing." I'm allowed to stare at nothing. It's my apartment. You're allowed to stare at nothing that isn't shaped like a 6-foot alpha with stupid good hair. I didn't answer that, because he was right, and because some truths don't need confirming out loud. I changed the subject instead, asked about his new boyfriend, let him talk about someone else's love story for a while so I didn't have to sit inside the wreckage of my own. What Angel didn't know, what nobody at my new company knew, was that in 3 days, I would be walking into a boardroom to discover the man overseeing the very project I'd been hired to lead. And that man would turn around, and the moment his eyes found mine, 2 years of careful, deliberate healing would crumble like wet paper. I didn't know it yet either. If I had, I might have quit before I even started, but some collisions, I've come to believe, cannot be outrun. They wait for you around corners you didn't know existed, patient as tide, patient as scent memory, patient as the parts of your body that remember a person even after your mind has sworn to forget. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and the particular hush of a place where careers are decided. I walked in with my portfolio under my arm and my spine as straight as I could manage, because that was the version of myself I wanted this new company to meet. Capable. Composed. Nothing like the omega who had once cried into a stranger's shoulder on a subway platform because a man who smelled like cedar and rain had stopped answering his messages. The head of the department stood to greet the room, and I recognized the back of his head before he even turned. Some part of me, the animal part, the part that predates language and reason, knew before my eyes confirmed it. My skin prickled. My pulse did something erratic and humiliating. And when he turned, and those familiar hazel eyes widened with the same shock currently detonating in my chest, I understood that the universe had a cruelty in it I hadn't accounted for. John. Not a stranger who resembled him, not a trick of memory. John Kestrel, in a charcoal suit that fit him like an apology he'd never given, standing exactly where fate apparently intended him to stand, directly in my path, permanently, for the foreseeable future. "James," he said, and just my name in his mouth undid something I thought I'd welded shut. I did not smile. I did not offer my hand. I gave him the flattest, most professional nod I could summon and took the empty seat as far from him as the table allowed, which was cruelly. Still close enough to catch his scent drifting toward me every time the ventilation system cycled the air. Cedar. Rain that hadn't fallen yet. Him. My body remembered before my mind gave permission, and I hated it for that. I hated the traitorous quickening under my ribs, the warmth that pooled low and unwanted, the way 2 years of practiced indifference evaporated in under 4 seconds. The meeting proceeded. Numbers were discussed. Timelines were drawn on a screen behind him. I heard perhaps a third of it because the rest of my attention was locked on not looking at him, which is its own exhausting form of looking. When it ended, when the others filed out with the particular relief people feel after successfully surviving a Monday morning, John lingered by the door like he thought I might simply walk past him, as if 2 years and a whole unfinished conversation didn't sit between us like a corpse neither of us had buried properly. "You look good," he said quietly once we were alone. "I look employed," I said. "There's a difference." "James, don't." My voice came out sharper than I intended, sharp enough that something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like pain, though I refused to trust my own reading of him anymore. "We're going to work together. Fine. I can be professional. But we are not going to do the part where you say my name like it still means something to you." "It does mean something to me. It used to." I gathered my folder against my chest like armor. "Past tense, John. That's the tense we're living in now." I walked out before he could answer, before the traitor in my chest could talk me into staying to hear whatever excuse he'd apparently been saving for 2 years, gathering dust like a gift nobody claimed. In the elevator, alone, I pressed my back against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes and reminded myself, syllable by syllable, why I had sworn never to forgive him. I should tell you what happened, because forgiveness only means something once you understand what it's being asked to absolve. 2 years ago, John Kestrel was the alpha I built my whole unspoken future around. We'd met in graduate school, in a library that smelled like old paper and ambition, and something between us had ignited slow and then all at once, the way good things sometimes do before they turn into catastrophes. He was steady where I was anxious. He laughed with his whole chest. He remembered the smallest details about me. The way I took my coffee, the songs that made me cry, the specific shade of blue I liked best in a sky. For 18 months, I believed I had found the kind of love people write songs about. He never rushed my heats, always waited for me to ask, always made me feel like a person first and an omega second, which is rarer than it should be in a world still tangled up in old hierarchies. Then his mother got sick, truly sick, the kind of sick that reorders a person's priorities overnight. He flew across the country to be with her, and I understood. I did, because family is family, and grief doesn't wait for convenient timing. What I didn't understand, what I still don't fully understand, is the silence that followed. Weeks of it. My messages sitting there, delivered but unanswered, the little check marks mocking me with their blue confirmation that he had, in fact, seen them and chosen not to respond. I told myself he was overwhelmed. I told myself grief does strange things to people. I gave him grace long after grace had curdled into something closer to self-abandonment. And then, 3 months into that silence, I heard, through a mutual friend, secondhand, the worst possible way to learn anything, that he had been seen with someone else. An alpha named Tyler, tall and confident, the kind of person who takes up a room without trying. They'd been photographed at some gathering, standing close, John's hand resting at the small of Tyler's back in a way that made my stomach fold in on itself when I saw the picture. I never got an explanation. I never got a goodbye. I got a photograph and a silence that had already answered every question I was too afraid to ask. So I did the only thing I had left. I deleted his number. I blocked every account. I let Angel hold my hair back while I cried in a way I promised myself I would never cry over another person again. And I rebuilt myself, slow and deliberate, brick by brick, until I believed I was someone new. Someone who didn't need him. Someone who could survive. That was the person who walked into that conference room, rebuilt, armored. And apparently, according to the way my body had betrayed me the moment his scent hit the air, not nearly as finished healing as I'd convinced myself I was. The weeks that followed were an exercise in controlled devastation. Work required us to sit in the same rooms, review the same documents, occasionally stand close enough at a shared monitor that his sleeve brushed mine and my whole nervous system lit up like a struck match. I hated it. I hated how easily my body forgot what my mind had decided. I hated that some nights I caught myself, mid-email, mid-meeting, simply watching the line of his jaw or the way his hands moved when he explained something, cataloging him the way I used to when I loved him without complication. Angel noticed the shift in my voice whenever I mentioned work now, a new tightness that hadn't been there before. "You're doing the thing where you pretend you're fine," he said over dinner one night, chopsticks pointed at me like an accusation. "I know the fine voice. I invented detecting the fine voice. I am fine." James. "I'm working with him, Angel. That's it. That's the whole story." "Is it?" I didn't answer because the honest answer was more complicated than I wanted to admit even to myself. It wasn't just proximity. It was the specific ache of being near someone you used to build a future with, watching him move through ordinary moments, laughing at a colleague's joke, rubbing the back of his neck when a deadline stressed him, sliding his tie loose after a long meeting, and feeling every one of those small gestures land somewhere tender and unhealed. One evening, working late on a presentation neither of us could delegate, it was just the two of us in the office, the building around us gone quiet and dim except for our little island of desk lamplight. He brought me coffee without asking, the way he used to, exactly the way I liked it. I stared at the cup longer than necessary, something twisting in my chest at the proof that he still remembered, that 2 years hadn't erased the small architecture of caring about someone. "You didn't have to," I said. "I wanted to." He sat across from me, closer than strictly necessary given the size of the office. "James, can we talk?" "Not about work." There's nothing to talk about." "There's everything to talk about." His voice had lost its careful professional edge, gone rough with something that sounded almost like desperation. "You think I don't know what it looked like? What you must have heard." My chest tightened. "I know what I saw, John. A photograph doesn't lie." "A photograph can absolutely lie," he said. "A photograph shows you one frozen second and lets you fill in every terrible story around it." "Then tell me the true story." My voice cracked despite my best effort to keep it steady. "Tell me why you disappeared. Tell me why 3 months of silence turned into a picture of you with someone else's hand." I stopped myself, throat closing around the rest of the sentence. He looked at me for a long moment, something raw and exhausted moving behind his eyes. "I will," he said finally. "I promise you I will tell you everything, but not tonight. Tonight you're too angry to hear it, and I'm too much of a coward to say it right." I laughed, short and humorless. "That's convenient. It's honest." He stood, gathering his jacket, putting distance between us before either of us did something we couldn't take back. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day of those 2 years." He left before I could respond, and I sat alone in that quiet office with his coffee going cold in front of me and my heart doing something complicated and unwelcome, aching in a shape I recognized from a version of myself I thought I'd retired for good. Heats don't care about timing. They don't care about pride or grudges or the careful walls a person spends 2 years constructing. Mine arrived 4 days early, apparently accelerated by stress or proximity or some cruel biological joke at my expense, and it hit me on a Friday afternoon while I was still at my desk. Halfway through reviewing a contract I would later have no memory of reading. The first wave felt like a low hum under my skin, easy to dismiss as fatigue. By the time I recognized it for what it was, my hands had started to shake and my skin had gone oversensitive, every brush of fabric suddenly too loud against my nerves. I made it to my car before the second wave hit, sharper this time, heat pooling low in my body with an intensity that made my vision blur at the edges. I should have called Angel. I should have called anyone but the one person my traitorous mind supplied first. Unbidden, the scent memory of cedar and almost rain rising up through the haze like a lighthouse I'd sworn never to sail toward again. I did not call John. I want that on record. I called a car service, gave them my address in a voice I barely recognized as my own, and spent the ride home with my forehead pressed to the cool window, trying to breathe through a fire that had nothing to do with temperature. What I didn't account for was the message that came through as I stumbled into my apartment, vision swimming, body shaking with a need I hated as much as I craved it. I'm sorry to text. Angel gave me your address in case of emergency months ago, before either of us knew we'd be working together again. He said to only use it if something felt wrong. Are you okay? Your scent hit the building an hour before you left. I could smell it in the hallway. I'm not asking to come over. I just need to know you're safe. I stared at the message through the fog, furious at Angel for an emergency contact list I'd forgotten existed, furious at my own body for the way it responded to even the digital ghost of John's concern. Warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a need I refused to name. I didn't answer. I turned my phone face down and wrote out the worst of the first night alone, the way I'd trained myself to do, gritting through hours that stretched like taffy, my body screaming for a presence I could not, allow myself to summon. By the second day, exhaustion had worn my defenses thin as paper. I don't remember deciding to call him. I remember only the phone against my ear, my voice smaller and more fractured than I wanted it to be, saying his name like a question I didn't have the strength to finish asking. James? His voice came through immediately, alert, careful. Are you all right? Talk to me. I hate this, I whispered, and I meant more than the heat, more than the fever climbing under my skin. I meant 2 years, and a photograph, and the unbearable fact that even now, even furious, even betrayed, some part of me still reached for him before anyone else. Tell me what you need, he said, voice steady in a way that anchored something loose and drifting in my chest. I'll do whatever you need, James. I'm not going anywhere. I didn't invite him over. I want to be honest about that, because pride still mattered to me even at my most unraveled. But I didn't hang up either. I let his voice stay on the line, low and careful, talking me through the worst of the waves, with a patience that undid me more thoroughly than any touch could have. He told me to drink water. He told me to breathe. He stayed on that call for 6 hours, past midnight, past the point where any reasonable person would have given up, and somewhere in that long, dark stretch of fever and need, I felt something in my resolve begin quietly to crack. Heats leave a particular kind of hangover, a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with an emotional rawness that makes everything feel too close to the surface. I woke on the third morning to sunlight slicing through my curtains and a text notification waiting on my phone. No pressure to respond. Just wanted you to know, I'm glad you're through the worst of it. Drink water. Eat something with protein. I'll bring soup by if you want it, or I'll stay away completely if that's what you need. Your call, always. Sir. I stared at that message for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. 2 years ago, I would have read tenderness into every word without question. Now I read it and felt the old caution rise up alongside something softer, something that scared me more than anger ever had. Angel showed up before I could decide how to respond, letting himself in with the spare key I'd given him for exactly this kind of situation. Arms full of groceries, and an expression that told me he already knew more than I'd told him. He called me, Angel admitted, setting bags on my counter. During your heat, freaking out, asking if you were okay, if he should come over, if he was overstepping by even checking. James, I've never heard that man sound so scared. You gave him my address. I gave him your address a year ago, in case of emergency. Back when I thought there was a chance you two might eventually be forced into the same industry circles, and I wanted you safe no matter what. Angel's voice softened. I didn't think it would actually happen, and for what it's worth, he didn't come over. He respected the line even when it clearly cost him something to do it. I sank onto my couch, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. I don't know what I'm doing, Angel. I built this whole life around never forgiving him. And now, my body won't stop reaching for him like none of it happened. Angel sat beside me, quiet for a moment, uncharacteristically gentle. Maybe, he said finally, your body isn't stupid. Maybe it's just further along in something your pride hasn't caught up to yet. That's terrifying. Yeah. He bumped his shoulder against mine. Love usually is. I didn't correct him on the word. I noticed that, later, lying awake that night, that when he said love, I hadn't flinched away from it the way I expected to. I agreed to hear him out on a Sunday, neutral ground, a quiet park bench far from the office and its complicated politics. He arrived early, which didn't surprise me, and he'd brought 2 coffees, mine made exactly right, which did surprise me, still, every time. Start from the beginning, I said. All of it. I don't want the version that makes you look better. I want the truth, even if it makes me hate you more. He nodded, hands wrapped around his cup like it was the only thing keeping him steady. My mother's illness was worse than I let on, at first. I didn't want to burden you with how bad it actually was, which I understand now was its own kind of mistake, treating you like something to protect instead of someone to trust. He exhaled slowly. The silence wasn't distance from you, it was drowning. I was in a hospital corridor for weeks, watching her get worse, and I genuinely didn't have words for anyone, not even myself. I read every message you sent. I just couldn't find a version of myself capable of answering that wouldn't fall apart the second I tried. That still doesn't explain Tyler. His jaw tightened. Tyler is my cousin, James. Not by blood, but close enough that our families have always treated it that way. He flew out to help me manage things because I was barely functioning. That photograph? He shook his head, something bitter in his laugh. That photograph was taken at my mother's memorial. He had his hand on my back because I had just collapsed at the reception, because grief had finally caught up to 2 months of running on nothing. He was holding me up, James, not holding me the way you thought. The park around us seemed to go very quiet. Your mother, I said slowly, the pieces rearranging themselves into a shape I hadn't let myself consider. She didn't get better. She passed, he said, voice steady but eyes glassy. 2 years ago next month. I lost her. And somewhere in the wreckage of that, I lost you too, because I was too broken to reach for you the way I should have, and by the time I resurfaced enough to try, you'd already blocked every way I had of finding you. He looked at me then, something raw and unguarded in his expression. I don't blame you for that. You protected yourself from a silence that felt like abandonment, because it looked exactly like abandonment from where you were standing. I just wish I'd been strong enough back then to let you in instead of shutting the whole world out, including the person I loved most in it. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the old architecture of my anger shift under new weight. Grief explained the silence. It didn't erase the pain of living inside that silence for months, not knowing, constructing worse and worse stories in the absence of truth. But it changed the shape of what I was angry about. I wasn't angry at betrayal anymore. I was angry at 2 people who had both been drowning and hadn't known how to reach for each other across the water. You should have told me, I said finally, quietly, even broken. Even just 3 words. I need time. Anything. I would have waited, John. I would have waited so long for you. I know that now. His voice cracked on the admission. I know it every single day I didn't have you. I'm not asking you to erase 2 years of hurt because I finally explained myself. I know that's not how healing works. I just needed you to know the truth, even if it changes nothing between us. I looked at him, really looked past the anger I'd been carrying like armor, and saw a man who had lost his mother alone, who had spent 2 years grieving 2 losses stacked on top of each other, who had shown up at my apartment door during my heat, only to stay on the other side of it because he respected me, even wounded, even furious, even certain I'd never forgive him. It doesn't change nothing, I said softly, surprising myself with the admission. It changes a lot, actually. Something in his face broke open, hope arriving cautious and unpracticed, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. James, I'm not saying I forgive you, I said quickly, before either of us could get ahead of the moment. I'm saying I understand you differently now. Those are not the same thing. Forgiveness is going to take time. Maybe a lot of time. I'll wait, he said without hesitation, without a single second of doubt in his voice. However long it takes, I already know how to wait for you, James. I've had 2 years of terrible practice. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with zero ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered. Link in the description. All right, back to where things get interesting. We didn't fall back into each other overnight, and I'm grateful for that now. Grateful that neither of us tried to skip the part where trust gets rebuilt. Slow and deliberate, like something load-bearing that can't afford shortcuts. We started with coffee after work. Careful conversations that stayed on safe ground, books we'd read, small updates about mutual friends, the ordinary architecture of two people relearning each other's edges. He never pushed. He never once tried to use my heat or the vulnerability it had exposed as leverage toward something faster than I was ready for. That restraint, more than any grand gesture, was what slowly began dismantling the wall I'd built. Angel remained skeptical for longer than I expected, watching from the sidelines with the protective wariness of someone who had held me together during the worst of the original breaking. I need to see him prove it, he told me one night. Not with words. Words are easy for people like him. I need to see 2 months of him showing up exactly the way he says he will. John got 2 months. He got them without complaint, without impatience, without a single instance of trying to rush what I needed to feel safe. He showed up when he said he would. He respected every boundary I set, even the ones that clearly cost him something to honor. He talked about his mother, sometimes small, unguarded memories that told me he trusted me with his grief, the way he hadn't been able to 2 years before, and each time he did. Something in my chest loosened another careful notch. Slowly, the anger I'd carried for 2 years began to feel less like armor and more like weight. Slowly, I started noticing the difference between the fear of being hurt again and the actual likelihood of it. And those two things, I realized, were not the same thing at all. One evening, working late again, the office quiet around us the way it had been, the night he first tried to explain himself, he looked up from his laptop and caught me watching him, the way I sometimes still did without meaning to. "What?" he asked, soft, no pressure in it. "Nothing," I said, and then, because honesty had started to feel less dangerous than it used to, I was just thinking that I don't hate having you in my life anymore. I used to. For a long time, I really did. And now? I considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. Now I think I missed you more than I ever let myself admit. Even angry. Even certain I never wanted to see you again. Some stubborn part of me kept missing you the whole time. He set his laptop aside, careful, unhurried, giving me every chance to change my mind or pull back. When I didn't, he reached across the small distance between our chairs and took my hand. Just that, nothing more. His thumb tracing slow, careful circles across my knuckles like he was relearning the shape of me. "I missed you every single day," he said. "I want you to know that even during the 2 years you hated me, you were still the person I measured every good thing against. Nothing ever felt right without you in it." I let my hand stay in his. It felt like the smallest, bravest thing I'd done in 2 years. My next heat arrived on schedule, no early acceleration this time, and I found myself facing a choice I hadn't expected to face again so soon, whether to ride it out alone, protected and armored the way I'd trained myself to do, or whether to let someone in. I texted him first this time. That alone felt significant, a door opening from my side rather than his. It's starting. "I don't know what I want yet. Can you just be near without anything happening? I need to know if that's even something you're capable of." His response came within a minute. "I can absolutely do that. I'll bring soup and my stubbornness and nothing else unless you ask for it. Just tell me when." He arrived an hour later, and true to his word, he didn't push a single boundary I hadn't offered. He made tea. He sat at a careful distance on my couch, close enough to be present, far enough to respect the fragile new trust we were building. When the fever climbed, when my skin turned oversensitive and my body ached with a need that scared me with its intensity, he simply stayed, talking softly, reminding me to breathe, letting me set every pace. Somewhere in the long, slow hours of that night, exhausted and stripped of pretense, I found myself closer to him than I'd planned, my head resting against his shoulder. His arm settled carefully around me. Nothing more urgent than comfort passing between us. "I trust you," I whispered into the quiet, surprised by how true it felt saying it out loud. "I didn't think I'd get here, but I trust you, John." His arms tightened around me, gentle, reverent. "That means more to me than anything you could have said 2 years ago," he murmured against my hair. "Trust rebuilt is worth more than trust that was never tested." We didn't rush past that moment into anything my body wanted, but my heart hadn't fully caught up to. We simply stayed there, tangled together on my couch, his heartbeat steady under my ear, and for the first time in 2 years, the ache in my chest wasn't grief. It was something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Angel showed up 2 days later with the specific expression of a man who had eyes and had used them. "So," he said, dropping onto my couch without invitation, "I take it the 2-month probation period is officially concluded. We're taking things slow." "James." He gave me a look. "There is a coffee mug on your counter that is not yours. There is a jacket on your hook that costs more than my rent. I know John Kestrel's cologne from 3 rooms away at this point, and it is currently soaked into your entire apartment." I felt heat climb my neck, though not the biological kind this time. "We've been spending time together." "That's all." "Uh-huh." Angel's teasing softened into something more sincere. "For what it's worth, and I don't say this lightly given how many nights I spent holding you together after he broke your heart, I think this version of him is different. I think 2 years of losing you taught him something the first version of him never learned. And I think you deserve to let yourself have this if it's what you actually want." "What if I'm scared?" I admitted, quieter than I meant to. "What if some part of me is always going to be scared, waiting for the silence to come back?" Angel considered that with the seriousness he reserved for moments that mattered. "Then you tell him that. Every time it comes up. That's the difference between then and now, James. Then, neither of you said the hard thing out loud. Now you actually can. That's not nothing. That might be everything." I thought about that for a long time after he left, turning the words over the way I'd turned over John's early morning texts, looking for the truth underneath. And I realized Angel was right, the way he almost always was. The fear hadn't disappeared. But I had a voice now, a willingness to use it, and a partner who had proven, patiently, consistently, that he would rather sit inside my fear with me than let silence answer for him ever again. I met Tyler properly a few weeks later at a small gathering John hosted, low-key and intentional, clearly designed to let me see the missing piece of the story with my own eyes rather than just hear about it secondhand. Tyler turned out to be warm in a way I hadn't expected from the tall, confident figure in that damning photograph, his handshake firm, his eyes carrying an apology before he even opened his mouth. "I owe you a conversation," he said, pulling me aside early in the evening, voice sincere. "I felt sick about that photograph for 2 years. If I'd known someone might see it and misread it the way you did, I would have deleted it the second it was taken." John was barely standing that day. I was just trying to keep my cousin upright through the worst day of his life. "I believe you," I said, and found that I genuinely did. "It wasn't your fault. Photographs lie. People fill in stories because the truth is scarier than the guessing." "For what it's worth," Tyler added, glancing across the room to where John stood laughing softly at something Angel had apparently said. The two of them already thick as old friends, in that easy way, Beta and Alpha, sometimes managed when neither was competing for anything. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not before, not after. It's honestly a little annoying watching a grown man become that transparent." I followed his gaze and found John already watching me, that same unguarded warmth in his expression that I remembered from before everything broke. Except now, it carried something new underneath it. The specific gratitude of a person who understood exactly how close he'd come to losing something irreplaceable, and had no intention of taking a second chance for granted. I crossed the room to him without deciding to, drawn the way I always seemed to be drawn, except now it didn't feel like betrayal of my own better judgment. It felt like choosing something I'd earned the right to choose. Having fun interrogating my cousin? John asked, low and warm, his hand finding the small of my back with a gentleness that asked permission even as it offered comfort. Getting closure, I said. It looks good on you, by the way. Being surrounded by people who love you. It looks better with you in the room, he murmured, and I let myself lean into him just slightly, just enough to feel the steady warmth of him against my side. And something in my chest settled fully into place for what felt like the first time in 2 long years. I want to tell you that once trust started rebuilding, it simply kept climbing steady and uninterrupted. But that would be a lie, and I promised myself somewhere in this whole ordeal that I was done telling comfortable lies, even to soften a story for someone else's ears. There was a night, roughly 5 months into our slow rebuilding, when doubt came back for me all at once, sudden and merciless, the way old wounds sometimes ache before a storm even though the injury healed years ago. John had gone quiet for 2 days. Not the same silence as before. He still answered texts, still confirmed our plans, still showed up exactly when he said he would. But there was a distance in his voice that I recognized instantly, some private weight he was carrying that he hadn't yet found words for. And instead of trusting the new architecture we'd built together, instead of simply asking him directly, the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, I felt the old panic climb up my spine like ivy through a crack in stone. I spiraled the way I used to spiral before I learned better. I imagined a dozen worst versions of the truth. I imagined another Tyler, another photograph, another silence stretching itself into a wall I wouldn't survive climbing twice. By the time he arrived at my apartment that evening carrying takeout and looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with me, I had already built an entire narrative of betrayal in my mind. Brick by frightened brick, undoing months of careful work in a single anxious afternoon. "You're upset," he said, setting the bags down carefully, reading my face the way he'd learned to over the months. "Talk to me. Please don't disappear into it the way you used to before we figured out how to do this differently." And here is the part I'm proudest of, looking back. The part that told me I had actually changed, and not simply convinced myself I had. I didn't disappear into it. I told him, shaking, embarrassed by how quickly the old fear had resurfaced, exactly what I'd been imagining. He didn't get defensive. He didn't tell me I was being irrational, even though some of it probably was. He sat with me on the couch, took both my hands in his, and told me the actual truth. His mother's anniversary was approaching the first one since we'd reunited. And he hadn't known how to tell me he was struggling without feeling like a burden, without repeating the exact mistake that had cost us 2 years the first time. "I almost did it again," he admitted, voice thick. "I almost went quiet instead of telling you I was hurting. I caught myself doing it, and I hated it, James. I hated that some part of me still defaults to disappearing when things get hard, even after everything we've rebuilt." "But you didn't disappear," I said softly, feeling the panic drain slowly out of my chest, replaced by something gentler. "You're here. You're telling me now." "Because you asked. Because you didn't let the silence win this time." He pressed his forehead against mine, both of us breathing slow and careful in the quiet apartment. "I'm still learning, James. I'm not going to pretend 2 years of therapy and effort erased 28 years of learning to handle pain alone. But I am learning. I promise you, I am." We sat together that whole evening, not fixing anything dramatically, just breathing through the old fear until it lost its grip. Both of us, a little wiser for having faced it honestly, instead of letting it fester into another silence. Neither of us could survive. I learned something important that night. That healing isn't a straight line. That old wounds ache sometimes even in a body that's mostly whole again. And that the real measure of what we'd rebuilt wasn't the absence of fear, but what we chose to do when the fear inevitably returned. We chose honesty. Both of us, finally, chose honesty over silence, and it made all the difference in the world. The following weekend, he took me to visit his mother's grave for the first time, a quiet, wind-swept hillside cemetery, 2 hours outside the city. He hadn't asked anyone to come with him before. not even Tyler, and the fact that he wanted me there on the anniversary of the worst day of his life told me more about how far we'd come than any speech could have. We stood together in the cold, his hand wrapped tight around mine, and he introduced me to her the way he might have introduced me while she was still alive, voice cracking as he spoke about the man he was trying to become, the mistakes he'd made, and the ways he was trying to unmake them. I said nothing, just stood beside him, present in a way I hadn't been able to be 2 years earlier, and when he finally turned to me, eyes red-rimmed and grateful, I understood that grief shared is a different animal than grief carried alone. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes bearable in a way solitary grief never can. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly on the drive home, the winter light fading gold across the fields outside the window. "I don't think I could have done that alone, not without falling apart the way I did before." "Clay, you don't have to do the hard things alone anymore," I told him, and meant it fully, without reservation, without the small, guarded corner of my heart that used to keep a portion of itself in reserve just in case. That's the whole point of this, John. Neither of us has to carry the hard things alone anymore. Months passed, gentle and unhurried, the kind of months that rebuild a life rather than simply filling time. We fell into a rhythm that felt nothing like the anxious, cautious beginning of us 2 years before, and nothing like the wreckage of the years after. It felt like something new entirely, something built by two people who had both learned, the hard way, what silence costs and what honesty is worth. I told him things I'd never told him the first time around, my fears fully articulated instead of buried, the specific shape of my anxiety when he traveled for work. The way certain silences still made my chest tighten even when I knew logically there was nothing to fear. He listened every time, without defensiveness, without impatience, adjusting where he could and simply holding space where he couldn't. He told me things too. About his mother, more and more as trust deepened, sharing memories that clearly still hurt, letting me see the grief instead of managing it alone in some closed room of himself the way he had before. He told me about the year he spent barely functioning, about therapy he'd started attending not long after our reunion, about the specific work he was doing to make sure he never again disappeared into silence when the people he loved needed him present. One evening on the same balcony where I'd once told the rain-scented sky I was done with him forever, he found me standing in nearly the same spot, and something about the symmetry of it made my throat tighten before he even said anything. "I know this exact spot," he said softly, coming to stand beside me. "You've mentioned it before. This is where you decided to give up on me, isn't it?" "How did you know that?" "Because you get a particular look when you're standing somewhere significant. I've learned to recognize it." He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his expression open and unguarded in a way that still, even now, occasionally stole my breath. "James, I know I don't get to erase what happened here. I know some part of you will probably always remember standing in this exact spot, deciding I wasn't worth the wait. But I wanted to ask you something, right here, in the same place, because I think it matters that it happens here instead of somewhere easier." My heart was doing something complicated, hope and old fear tangled together in a way I was slowly learning to hold without letting either one win completely. "I'm not asking for a bond yet," he said, voice steady despite the vulnerability in it. "I know we're not there. I just need to ask you something smaller, something I should have said the very first day we ran into each other in that conference room, instead of letting my pride and my fear keep me quiet for weeks. James, I love you. I never stopped, not for a single day of those 2 years, not even when I thought I'd lost you completely and had no right to keep loving you the way I did. I love you, and I would like, if you'll let me, the chance to keep proving it every single day for as long as you'll have me." The rain that had almost fallen the night I gave up on him finally arrived, soft and unhurried, gathering on the railing between us, on his shoulders, on my upturned face as I looked at him and felt every careful brick of the wall I'd built come down, not with a crash, but with a quiet, deliberate gentleness that felt like the opposite of loss. "I love you too," I said, and the words came easier than I expected, easier than 2 years of guarded silence should have allowed, But maybe that was the truth of it. Maybe love, real love, waits patiently under grief and anger and self-protection, ready to surface again the moment it's finally safe to breathe. He kissed me then, careful at first, like he still couldn't quite believe he'd earned it, and then with a growing certainty that mirrored the rain-gathering weight around us. And I felt 2 years of careful armor dissolve into something that had been waiting underneath the whole time, patient as scent memory. Patient as a body that had never really stopped choosing him, even when my mind swore it never would. People imagine forgiveness as a single moment, a door swinging open all at once. But I've learned it's closer to a long hallway, walked one careful step at a time, some days moving forward. Some days needing to simply stand still and breathe before continuing on. I forgave John Kestrel slowly, deliberately, testing each new piece of trust before laying the next brick down. And in the months that followed that rain-soaked confession on my balcony, I watched him prove, over and over, in 1,000 small, unglamorous ways, that he had learned the lesson his silence once cost us both. He answered every message, even the hard ones. He talked about hard things instead of disappearing into them. He asked before he assumed, checked in before he presumed, gave me room to be angry when I needed it, and held me close when what I needed instead was simply presence. Angel, ever the skeptic turned reluctant believer, eventually admitted defeat over dinner one night, watching John clear our plates in my kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who now belonged there. "I hate that I like him now," he grumbled. I had a whole speech prepared. Several, actually. I was very ready to hate him forever on principle. "You can still hate him a little," I offered, smiling in a way that felt easy now, unforced, nothing like the careful armor I used to wear around this exact subject. "No," Angel sighed, watching the two of us with something soft under his usual dry humor. "I think I'm stuck rooting for you both now." Disgustingly. Against my better judgment. Tyler became a regular fixture too, folded into the small constellation of people who mattered to me, his easy warmth, a welcome addition rather than the threat that single photograph once made him seem. We laughed, eventually, about how close 2 years of happiness had come to being lost over one frozen frame of a grieving man being held up by his cousin. "The universe has a strange sense of humor," Tyler said once, raising a glass at some gathering or another. "Nearly destroying true love with one badly timed photo." "The universe," John said, catching my eye across the table with that same unguarded warmth that had slowly, patiently rebuilt everything between us, also apparently believes in second chances, so I'll forgive it the joke. A year after that rain-soaked confession, on an evening I'd chosen deliberately, on solid ground I'd built myself, rather than ground that had simply happened to us, I asked John Kestrel to bond with me. I want to be clear that this was my choice, made with open eyes, full knowledge of what love costs and what silence once cost us both. I wasn't the same person who had once built a future around him without questioning whether that future was safe. I was someone who had tested him, deliberately, patiently, and found him worthy of the risk a second time. We stood in the same apartment where I'd once ridden out a heat alone, rather than call him where he'd once sat carefully at a respectful distance, proving he could be trusted with my vulnerability, where 2 years of careful rebuilding had finally quietly become something unbreakable. "I used to think forgiving you would feel like losing," I told him, my hand resting over his heart, feeling it beat steady and sure beneath my palm. "Like admitting the hurt didn't matter. Like letting you off some hook you deserve to stay on forever. But it doesn't feel like losing at all. It feels like choosing something I nearly threw away out of fear, and getting the impossible chance to choose it again, better, wiser, with my eyes fully open this time. I will spend every day making sure you never regret that choice," he said, voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide from me. "I lost you once because I let grief silence me. I will never let silence stand between us again, James. Not ever. I promise you that with everything I have." The bond, when it came, felt nothing like the desperate hunger of that first heat 2 years before. It felt like coming home to a house you helped rebuild with your own hands, every board and beam chosen deliberately, every crack repaired with care instead of rushed over. It felt like two people who had both learned, the hardest way possible, exactly what love requires to survive, not perfection, but honesty. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to speak through it instead of disappearing into silence. Outside, it began to rain, soft and steady. The same particular metal sweetness I remembered from the night I swore I'd never forgive him. I used to think that scent meant an ending, the air holding its breath before something broke. I know better now. Sometimes rain isn't an ending at all. Sometimes, it's simply the sky finally letting go of everything it's been holding, making room for something new to grow underneath. People always want the story to end at the bond, as if the ceremony itself is the destination, rather than simply a doorway into something quieter and, I think, far more remarkable, the ordinary days that came after. I want to tell you about those days too, because I think they matter more than the dramatic ones, more than the balcony confession or the 6-hour phone call during my worst heat or even the bond itself. Love, I've learned, is mostly built in the unremarkable hours nobody writes songs about. It's built in mornings when John wakes before me and I hear him moving quietly through the kitchen, careful not to disturb my sleep. The soft clink of a kettle. The low hum of him humming some song under his breath that he doesn't even realize he does. It's built in the specific way he still asks every single time, whether it's all right to touch me, even now, even bonded. Even years past the point where such careful attention might seem unnecessary to anyone who hasn't lived through what we lived through. It's built in the small fights we still have, because bonding didn't make us perfect, only committed. We argue sometimes about ordinary things, whose turn it is to handle the dishes, whether we're spending enough time with Angel and Tyler, the particular way John still sometimes goes quiet when he's stressed instead of voicing it immediately. But the arguments look different now. They end in conversation instead of silence. They end in both of us reaching toward each other instead of retreating into separate corners to nurse old wounds alone. Angel and Tyler ended up closer than either of us expected. An unlikely friendship built on their shared, exasperated affection for the two of us and our admittedly dramatic history. They host dinners now. The four of us gathered around a table that has slowly become one of the steadiest places in my life. Full of easy laughter and old inside jokes, and the specific comfort of people who watched you fall apart and stayed anyway. I still think, sometimes, about the version of myself who stood on that balcony 2 years into heartbreak, certain I would never let John Kestrel back into my life. I don't regret that version of me, not even a little. That anger was necessary. That distance gave both of us room to become people capable of loving each other properly, instead of simply falling back into old patterns out of habit or fear of being alone. But I'm grateful, endlessly grateful, that my body remembered something my pride had sworn to forget. I'm grateful for scent memory, for the particular ache that wouldn't quiet no matter how hard I tried to silence it. For whatever stubborn biological instinct kept recognizing him as home, even when every rational argument told me to run the other direction. Some people will read this story and think it's strange that love could survive such a long silence, such deep hurt, a photograph that nearly destroyed something real over a misunderstanding neither of us caused directly. I understand the skepticism. I lived inside that skepticism for 2 long years, but I also lived through what came after. I lived through watching a man rebuild himself, slowly and honestly, into someone capable of the vulnerability he'd once been too broken to offer. I lived through learning to voice my fears instead of burying them, through choosing honesty even when honesty was terrifying, through discovering that forgiveness isn't a single door swinging open, but a long hallway walked one deliberate step at a time. And I lived through falling in love with him twice, once by accident in a library that smelled like old paper and ambition, and once on purpose with my eyes fully open. Knowing exactly what love costs and choosing to pay it anyway. People ask me sometimes, Angel, especially half teasing and half genuinely curious, how I went from swearing I'd never forgive John Kestrel to standing beside him permanently bonded. building a life neither of us had dared imagine during those 2 broken years apart. I tell them the truth. The same truth I eventually told myself, standing on that rain-soaked balcony. My mind swore an oath. My body never fully agreed to keep. Somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the very real and justified hurt, some quieter part of me kept recognizing him, kept reaching for him, kept remembering the specific warmth of a love that had never actually died, only gone into hiding, waiting for enough safety to resurface. I don't think that makes the anger wrong. I don't think it makes the 2 years of grief and distance and hard-won healing unnecessary. I needed every one of those years to become someone capable of loving him wisely instead of desperately. Someone who chose him with open eyes instead of simply falling into old patterns out of habit or loneliness. But I've stopped being ashamed of what my body knew before my pride was ready to admit it. Love, real love, doesn't always announce itself through grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it announces itself quietly, persistently, in the specific way your pulse quickens at a familiar scent, in the traitorous warmth that rises even when your mind is busy building walls, in the simple, undeniable fact that some connections, once real, don't fully disappear just because we ask them to. John still brings me coffee exactly the way I like it every single morning, a small ritual that means more now than it ever did before. Because I know now what that small remembered detail actually costs and represents, a person choosing daily deliberately to keep paying attention to the people they love. We built something stronger from the wreckage of what broke us, brick by careful brick, honesty by hard-won honesty. And every time it rains now, that particular metal sweetness in the air before the first drop falls, I think of a promise I once made to a stormy sky and a different promise I chose instead. Standing on the same balcony a year later, rain finally falling around us like the world exhaling a breath it had been holding since the night everything nearly ended. The Omega swore he'd never forgive him. Then his body, wiser than his pride, patient as memory, stubborn as love itself, made a different decision entirely. I have never once regretted letting it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.